Hello, I'm Professor Sims, and this is Gen Bio 1, Lesson 1, The Basics of Biology. This is the first of 10 lessons included in my General Biology 1 lecture course. In this lesson, we will identify and describe the properties of life, describe the levels of organization among living things, recognize and interpret phylogenetic trees, list examples of different subdisciplines in biology, and recognize the uniqueness of certain basic principles of biology. I'm going to talk first about how biology came to become a science of its own. It actually took a very long time for biology to be officially recognized as its own scientific field, because in order for scientists from the mid-18th to mid-20th century to agree to separate biology from other sciences such as math and physics, three specific things had to happen. First was the refutation of certain erroneous principles, which we'll describe in a little bit. Next was the demonstration that certain principles of physics cannot be applied to living things. And then finally came the realization that there are certain autonomous characteristics of biology that are simply not applicable to non-living things. The nature of life has always been a puzzle for philosophers. Some described an organism as just a machine, while others operated as if there was no difference between living and non-living things. But this did not satisfy most naturalists and developmental biologists who asked, how can a machine regenerate lost parts, as many organisms do? How can a machine replicate itself? How can two machines fuse into a single one, like the fusion of two gametes to produce a zygote? These vitalists were convinced that just as the motion of planets and stars is controlled by an invisible force called gravity, movements and other manifestations of life must be controlled by an invisible force, which they called Lebenskraft or vis vitalis. Vitalism was popular for hundreds of years. The end of vitalism came after the failure of literally thousands of unsuccessful experiments conducted to demonstrate the existence of a Lebenskraft, and the subsequent realization that the new biology, with the methods of genetics and molecular biology, was able to solve all of the problems for which scientists traditionally had invoked the Lebenskraft. Teleology was the second erroneous principle that had to be eliminated before biology qualified as a science. Teleology deals with the explanation of natural processes that seem to lead to a definite end or goal. This principle was used by Aristotle to explain the development of a fertilized egg into an adult. Kant tried to explain adaptations found in living things in terms of Newtonian physics, but was unsuccessful, so he ascribed all of them to teleology instead. The so-called orthogeneticists invoked teleology to explain all evolutionary phenomena, believing that in living nature there is an intrinsic striving towards perfection. But no evidence for the existence of such a principle could ever be found, and genetic and paleontological discoveries eventually discredited teleology. Hundreds of years ago, the concept of diversity was that the world consisted of a limited number of sharply delimited and unchanging essences, or types. This viewpoint was called typology. Typology said that all phenomenon existed within a limited number of essences, each forming a class. The members of each class were thought to be identical, constant, and sharply separated from the members of any other class. And variations within a class were not accounted for, they were deemed insignificant. The essentialists used triangles to illustrate this concept. They said all triangles have the same fundamental characteristics and are sharply delimited against quadrangles, for example, but an intermediate shape between a triangle and a quadrangle was inconceivable. Typological thinking, being unable to accommodate for variation within, say, a species, is the type of thinking that gave rise to the erroneous concept of human races, and indeed racism. Because to typologists, Caucasians, Africans, Asians, and Inuits are all completely separate essences, sharply separated from each other and from other human ethnic groups. Thankfully, Darwin was able to completely reject typology with his observations on the origin of a species. Determinism couldn't apply to biology because it left no room for variation or chance events. Strict determinists thought that having a complete knowledge of the world as it exists would allow one to predict the future to infinity. The refutation of strict determinism and all possibility of absolute prediction freed the way for the study of variation and of chance phenomenon, which of course are very important to biology. Most physicalists were reductionists. That means they claimed that explanation of a system was resolved as soon as the system had been reduced to its smallest components. So, as soon as one had completed the inventory of these smallest components, then that means that they had determined the function of all of them, and it would be an easy task to also explain everything observed at the higher levels of organization. Yeah, this definitely doesn't apply to living things. So finally, such biological concepts as selection, speciation, competition, population, adaptation, biodiversity, ecosystems, none of these fit easily into universal laws of math and physics. The inability to categorize living systems and processes into universal laws and these other principles that are so basic in the physical sciences contributed to the insight that biology is simply not the same as physics. And this was the first and perhaps the hardest step in developing a sound philosophy of biology. Biological systems are open systems, and the principles of entropy are therefore not applicable. Owing to their complexity, biological systems are richly endowed with capacities such as reproduction, metabolism, replication, regulation, adaptation, growth, and hierarchy. Nothing of this sort exists in an inanimate world. Even before Darwin, geologists knew about changes on the Earth's surfaces, and cosmologists were aware of changes in the universe, particularly in the solar system. However, the world was seen as something quite constant, something that had not changed since the day of creation. And this view totally changed after the middle of the 19th century when science became aware of the comprehensiveness of the evolution of the living world. The adoption of the concept of biopopulation is responsible for what now seems probably the most fundamental difference between inanimate and the living world. The inanimate world consists of Plato's classes, essences, and types, with the members of each class being identical and with the seeming variation being accidental and therefore irrelevant. In a biopopulation, the properties of populations change from generation to generation in a gradual manner, and to think of the living world as a set of forever variable populations grading into each other from generation to generation results in a concept of the world that is totally different from that of a typologist and is one of the most fundamental differences between biology and the so-called exact sciences. Furthermore, all biological processes differ in one respect fundamentally from all processes in the inanimate world, in that they are subject to dual causation. In contrast to purely physical processes, biological processes are controlled not only by natural laws but also by genetic programs. This duality provides a clear demarcation between inanimate and living processes. There's not a single phenomenon or a single process in the living world that is not in part controlled by a genetic program contained in the genome, and there's nothing comparable to this in the inanimate world. So, biology is the study of living things. But what exactly is a living thing? This may sound like a silly question, but defining life is not so simple. For example, a branch of biology called virology studies viruses. But scientists don't all agree that viruses are living organisms because they do not meet all of the criteria to define life. Namely, the shared properties that make something alive are order, sensitivity or response to stimuli, reproduction, adaptation, growth and development, regulation, homeostasis, energy processing, and evolution. Biologists study how living things function. They organize the remarkable diversity of life by their shared characteristics in order to better understand them, and they seek to ultimately understand how the diversity of life arose and continues to develop. The first characteristic of life is order. How are cells organized into tissues, organs, organ systems that make up complex living organisms? Even within cells, organelles are composed of molecules, which are in turn made of atoms. The complex yet highly ordered nature of living organisms is what allows for specialization, speciation, and adaptation. For example, specialized cells come together to form organs such as the heart, lung, or skin in organisms like the toad shown here in this figure. Even very simple single-celled organisms are remarkably complex. This may seem counterintuitive, like how can a single-celled organism be considered complex and ordered? But remember, for nearly 2/3 of the history of life on Earth, all organisms consisted of just one cell, and there's still plenty of single-celled organisms today. In fact, they far outnumber multicellular organisms. And theirs is a simple, uncomplicated life, but they have complex mechanisms for obtaining energy, expelling waste, reproducing, etc. Thus, they have specialized organelles such as mitochondria, ribosomes, vacuoles, and the like for these purposes. Multicelled organisms have evolved from single-celled organisms. They are greater in size, they're better able to seek out or maintain an environment conducive to life, in contrast to single-celled organisms which are largely at the mercy of their environment. Multicellular organism cells are grouped according to their similar structure and collectively perform a specific common function. These grouped cells form tissues, grouped tissues form organs, and grouped organs form systems. The second characteristic of life is sensitivity in response to stimuli. Various receptors receive physical or chemical stimuli, which cause chemical or nervous impulses to be generated in response. Some examples include mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, pain receptors, chemoreceptors, photoreceptors. Even tiny bacteria can move toward or away from chemicals, a process called chemotaxis, right? Movement toward a stimulus is considered a positive response, while movement away from a stimulus is a negative response. Figure 111 shows examples of plants responding to stimuli, namely touch and light. The leaves of Mimosa pudica will instantly droop and fold when touched, and young sunflowers follow the sun throughout the day in response to circadian rhythms, hormones, and temperature changes. The third characteristic of life is reproduction. Reproduction can be asexual or sexual. The specific methods of each will be further discussed in a later lesson, but in general, sexual reproduction requires two parents. Asexual only requires one. Sexual reproduction employs a sperm or fertilized egg. In plants, you have spermatophores. Lower life forms have things like oocytes. Two cells or two things that come together, right? Asexual, you have a single organism that just makes an exact copy of itself. Sexual reproduction is used by animals, flowering plants, some fungi. Asexual is usually in bacteria, but also in some plants and fungi, and in certain animals like sponges. Sexual reproduction have offspring that are different from their parents. Asexual reproduction has offspring that are identical to their parent. Sexual reproduction provides genetic variation, but it does have the downfall of being time-consuming. Asexual reproduction is fast, easy, but its downfall is there's no genetic variation. Some organisms can do both asexual or sexual reproduction, depending on their specific environmental conditions and or the stage of growth cycle in which it's currently existing. The fourth criteria of life is adaptation. All living organisms exhibit a fit to their environment. Biologists refer to this fit as adaptation and is a consequence of evolution by natural selection, which operates in every lineage of reproducing organism. Examples of adaptations are diverse and unique, from heat-resistant archaea that live in boiling hot springs to the tongue length of a nectar-feeding moth that matches the size of the flower from which it feeds. Positive adaptations enhance the reproductive potential of the individual exhibiting them, and these adaptations change as the environment changes. This fox skull shows the teeth of a carnivore, which are generally long with sharp front teeth and narrow, serrated back teeth used for slicing and tearing through meat and flesh. Conversely, on the right here, the squirrel jaw shows teeth of an herbivore. Herbivores have broad, flat molars in the back with rough surfaces for grinding plant tissues, and some have chisel-like front teeth for gnawing through wood or hard seeds. These are examples of adaptations passed down from generation to generation amongst animals surviving on specialized sources of food in their respective environments. The fifth characteristic of life is growth and development. Organisms grow and develop according to specific instructions coded for by their genes, which provides instructions that ensure that the organism's young will grow up to exhibit many of the same characteristics as itself, as the adult. Life is essentially a journey that begins at fertilization and ends at death. It's an interesting and complicated process in which one developmental stage follows the next in a carefully choreographed dance. The changes that occur during development are nothing short of amazing. For example, a butterfly starts as an egg that hatches into a larva, then molts into a caterpillar. The caterpillar lives for a time and eats and grows, and then later it forms a chrysalis and undergoes a huge developmental change. Activation of hormones such as ecdysone, juvenile hormone, and capsase cause the caterpillar and its chrysalis to pupate, and then in its final form, it is an adult butterfly, so it looks completely different from the caterpillar. If that doesn't impress you, consider human growth and development. In just 9 months, a single undifferentiated cell ultimately develops into a human baby. First, follicle-stimulating hormone, estradiol, and lutein hormone work in conjunction to release a single egg from its follicle. This is what is known as ovulation. Next, upon fertilization with a sperm cell, the fertilized egg is now a zygote, which produces a hormone called chorionic gonadotropin and develops into an embryo over the span of 10 to 12 weeks. In this time, the embryo begins to form organs such as the brain and the heart, with the heart beginning to pump blood at about week 10. The embryo grows from about the size of a pinhead at week 2 to about an inch long at week 12, and then at week 13, the embryo, which is now called a fetus, is making its own thyroid hormone, its own insulin, and urine. It has grown to about 6 inches long on average. And then over the next several weeks, the embryo will develop lungs, functional ears, and eyes, but it's not yet able to live outside of the womb. 23 weeks after fertilization, a human fetus is about 11 inches long, has recognizable facial features, but still only has a survival rate of about 30% outside of the womb at this stage. Survival rate jumps to over 90% at about week 28 post-fertilization. And now the fetus is about 15 inches long, weighs about 2.5 pounds, has eyelashes, and then a fetus is at full term at 37 to 41 weeks. The average size of human baby is usually about 19.8 to 20.5 inches long and from 7.5 to 8.5 pounds. But this is only the first stage in our development. In fact, it takes up to 25 years for the human brain to fully develop. And then, of course, we go through all kinds of changes throughout our life and into our golden years before we ultimately die, usually at about the age of 87. The sixth criterion for living things is regulation and homeostasis. Even the smallest organisms require multiple regulatory mechanisms to coordinate internal functions, such as the transport of nutrients, response to stimuli, and coping with environmental stresses. For example, organ systems such as digestive or circulatory systems perform specific functions like carrying oxygen throughout the body, removing waste, delivering nutrients to every cell, and cooling the body. In order to function properly, cells require appropriate conditions such as proper temperature, pH, and concentrations of diverse chemicals. These conditions may, however, change from one moment to the next, and organisms are able to maintain internal conditions within a narrow range almost constantly, despite environmental changes, through a process called homeostasis, or steady state, which is the ability of an organism to maintain constant internal conditions. For example, many organisms regulate their body temperature in a process known as thermoregulation. Organisms that live in cold climates, such as this polar bear, have body structures that help them withstand low temperatures and conserve body heat. In hot climates, organisms have methods such as perspiration in humans or panting in dogs that help them to shed excess body heat. The seventh characteristic of life is energy processing. All organisms use a source of energy for their metabolic activities. Some organisms capture energy from the sun or inorganic substances and then convert it into chemical energy. These organisms are called autotrophs. And then other organisms called heterotrophs use chemical energy from organic molecules that they take in from other organisms that they eat. So autotrophs produce their own energy. They are the primary level in the food chain. It means they're at the bottom of the food chain. They gain energy from the sun or inorganic molecules. And some examples are things like plants and algae and bacteria. Heterotrophs don't produce their own energy. They are in the middle or sometimes the top of the food chain. They get their energy from eating other organisms. And these include things like herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. The final criteria of life is that it evolves. Populations, not individuals, evolve over many generations by mutations that produce genetic variation. This figure shows an example of different finch species that evolved from a common ancestor in such a way that their beak shapes and sizes changed over time, and natural selection favored specific beak changes in specific finches with specific feeding habits living in specific environments, called niches. In addition to natural selection, several events can influence evolutionary processes. For example, the pool of alleles in a population can be affected by genetic drift, gene flow, and even selective hunting practices. We touched on it before, but living things are grouped into hierarchies ranging from small to large, that is from a single atom up to an entire biosphere. And life on Earth and the systems in which they exist are extremely varied and diverse due to billions of years of evolution and natural selection. The atom is the smallest and most fundamental unit of matter. It consists of a nucleus surrounded by electrons. Atoms form molecules. A molecule is a chemical structure consisting of at least two atoms held together by a chemical bond. Many molecules that are biologically important are macromolecules, which are large molecules typically formed by combining smaller units, such as monomers. An example of a macromolecule is deoxyribonucleic acid, in other words, DNA. DNA contains instructions for the functioning of the organism in which it resides. Some cells contain aggregates of macromolecules surrounded by membranes. These are called organelles. Organelles are small structures that exist within cells and perform specialized functions. All living things are made of cells. The cell itself is the smallest fundamental unit of life. Cells are classified as prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms that lack organelles. They do not have nuclei. In contrast, the cells of eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles and nuclei. In most multicellular organisms, cells combine to make tissues, which are groups of similar cells carrying out the same function. Organs are collections of tissues grouped together based on a common function. An organ system is a higher level of organization that consists of functionally related organs. For example, vertebrate animals have many organ systems, such as the circulatory system that transports blood throughout the body into and from the lungs. It includes organs such as the heart and blood vessels. Organisms are individual living entities. For example, each tree in a forest is an organism. Single-celled prokaryotes and single-celled eukaryotes are also considered organisms, typically referred to as microorganisms. All the individuals of a species living within a specific area are collectively called a population. For example, a forest may include many white pine trees. All of these pine trees represent the population of white pine trees in this forest. Different populations may live in the same specific area. For example, the forest with the pine trees includes populations of flowering plants and insects and microbial populations. A community is the set of populations inhabiting a particular area. For example, all the trees, flowers, insects, and other populations in a forest form the forest's community. The forest itself is an ecosystem. An ecosystem consists of all living things in a particular area together with the abiotic or non-living parts of that environment, such as nitrogen in the soil or rainwater. At the very highest level of organization is the biosphere. The biosphere is a collection of all ecosystems, and it represents the zones of life on Earth. It includes land, water, and portions of the atmosphere. So this figure shows some illustrations of these different groupings and hierarchies. So yeah, it goes from organelles within the cell to human blood cells here. This is human skin, which is, of course, a tissue. You have the digestive system here in humans. This is your example of the forest, which contains different organisms and different populations and community. And then, of course, the ecosystem all the way up to the biosphere. A phylogenetic tree is a diagram showing the evolutionary relationships among biological species based on similarities and differences in genetic or physical traits, or sometimes both genetic and physical traits. In the past, biologists grouped living organisms into 5 kingdoms: animals, plants, fungi, protists, and bacteria. The pioneering work of American microbiologist Carl Wise in the early 1970s showed that life on Earth evolved along 3 lineages, now called domains, and they are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Wise proposed the domain as a new taxonomic level and archaea as a new domain to reflect the new phylogenetic tree. Many organisms belonging to the archaea domain live under extreme conditions and are called extremophiles. To construct his tree, Wise used genetic relationships rather than similarities based on morphology or, how they looked. Various genes were used in phylogenetic studies, and Wise's tree was constructed from comparative sequencing of the genes that are universally distributed, conserved, and of appropriate length. So this is the tree that we have now based on the genetic work pioneered by Carl Wise. Like any phylogenetic tree, it's composed of branch points, or nodes, and branches. The internal nodes represent ancestors. And these are points in evolution when based on scientific evidence. An ancestor is thought to have diverged to form 2 new species, and the length of each branch can be considered as relative estimates of evolutionary time. The domain eukarya contains organisms that have cells with nuclei. It includes the kingdoms of fungi, plants, animals, and several kingdoms of protists. The archaea are single-celled organisms without nuclei and include many extremophiles that live in harsh environments like the hot springs. And then your bacteria are quite different from the other groups, and both the archaea and bacteria contain single-celled prokaryotic organisms. So here you see the tree, like the main trunk, would be the common ancestor for all life. And then the first branch here in evolutionary time is the archaea, and the second one is going to be bacteria, and then eukarya was the last one to evolve.
At the broadest level, all life on Earth can be assigned into one of 3 major groups called domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. While the diversity of life within each of these domains is vast, organisms in the domain share certain characteristics, such as similar cell structures and related sequences of ribosomal RNA. 2 of the 3 domains, domain bacteria and domain archaea, contain prokaryotic organisms. These are single-celled organisms that do not have a membrane-bound nucleus. Archaea live in aquatic environments that lack oxygen or are too salty, too hot, or too acidic for most organisms. The ability of some archaea to live in environmental conditions similar to the early Earth gives an indication of the ancient heritage of the domain. As scientists look for life on other planets and moons, they are often looking for evidence of archaean-like organisms. Bacteria are found almost everywhere, in the water, soil, and atmosphere, as well as on our skin and in our mouths and large intestines. Although some bacteria cause diseases, others can be very beneficial. Many of our drugs are manufactured using bacteria, and bacteria play an important role in the processing of many of our foods. In our bodies, both our digestive and immune systems rely on the action of beneficial bacteria. While archaea and bacteria domains are both prokaryotic, studies of their ribosomal RNA indicate they are not closely related to one another. In addition, their cell walls are considerably different. The bacterial cell wall contains peptidoglycan as well as protein, polysaccharides, and lipids. The archaeal cell wall lacks peptidoglycan, but does contain proteins, polysaccharides, and lipids. Final domain, domain eukarya, includes the eukaryotes, or organisms that have a membrane-bound nucleus. Most eukaryotes have internal organelles, such as mitochondria and chloroplasts, and, in general, eukaryotic cells are much bigger than the prokaryotes. Domain eukarya is subdivided into 4 kingdoms: the protists, plants, fungi, and animals.
In the 18th century, a scientist called Carl Linnaeus proposed his system of naming and grouping species of organisms into a hierarchical taxonomy. In this naming system, species that are most similar to each other are in the same genus, similar genre are grouped within a family, and this type of grouping continues all the way up until single organisms are collected together into groups at the highest level, which is the domain. The current taxonomic system now has 8 levels in its hierarchy. From lowest to highest, they are species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. Right, so species are grouped within genre are grouped within families are grouped within orders, and so on. In addition to this taxonomic system, Linnaeus was the first to name organisms using two unique names, a system called the binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature always includes the genus and species name. The genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, and both are typed in italics or handwritten with an underline under both words. Before Linnaeus, the use of common names to refer to organisms caused confusion because there were regional difference in common names, usually due to difference in language. Binomial names are all in the same language, they're in Latin, and they're recognized the world over so that a scientist in any location speaking any language will know exactly which organism is being referred to at any given time. The scope of biology is very broad and therefore contains many branches and subdisciplines. For example, molecular biology studies biological processes and interactions among molecules such as RNA, DNA, proteins, as well as the way they are regulated. Microbiology is the study of microorganisms, and depending on the subject of study, there are also microbial physiologists, ecologists, and geneticists, to name just a few specialties. Another field of biological study, neurobiology, studies the biology of the nervous system, and although it's considered a branch of biology, it's also recognized as an interdisciplinary field of study known as neuroscience. Because of its interdisciplinary nature, this subdiscipline studies different functions of the nervous system using molecular cellular development, medical, and computational approaches. Paleontology uses fossil to study life's history. Zoology and botany are the study of animals and plants, respectively. Biotechnologists apply the knowledge of biology to create useful products. Ecologists study the interactions of organisms in their environments. Physiologists study the workings of cells, tissues, and organs, and this is just a small sample of the many fields that biologists pursue. Ongoing technological developments, particularly those used to describe and manipulate genetic material, allows biologists to continue to improve our understanding of the nature of life, its history, our relationship to it, how the human body works, and even how humans can survive as a species on Earth. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to do the reading, check the description for more videos related to these topics, and leave your questions for me in the comments below.